Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances in the Kuru direction. There's also a Russian advance within Terny in the northeast. There's some back and forth between Russian and Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to advance beyond the capture of Shakhtarsk, capturing the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, a couple of forest lines and fields in between that of Yasna Polyana and Shakhtarsk, and towards Velika Novosilka. This indicates an interest in the Russian forces to fight in the direction of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and hit the supply of Velika Novosilka, everything that's east of the Mukhiya River. So capturing Rostolne would do that, cutting off completely the supply of the Ukrainian forces from the east. The Russians then move on to Novy Komar. Then there's also a cut off from the north, leaving only the western route in and out of Velika Novosilka. Combined with offensive operations by the Russians here west of the Remevsky Lech area, the Russians could completely cut off the supplies to Velika Novosilka. In the eastern direction, the Russians are slowly advancing north of Bohoyavlenka along the forest lines towards Trudova. And in the eastern direction, they have launched an operation to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here south of Kurakhove. The Russians are here flanking the Ukrainian fortified positions from the rear. And this made me think about something. The Ukrainian forces have built these fortified positions to cover from an eastern direction. There's no coverage in the south. There are some areas where they are square or circular fortified positions which cover in every direction, but you also have to think about the fact that these fortified positions aren't made to cover the rear. Despite them being circular and square edged, it is to cover the direction in which they expect the Russian forces to come from, and in this direction it is clear they're expecting them to come from the east. Therefore, the western parts is actually going to be left with a gap, this part here. And the reason for that is if the Russians do capture the fortified positions, they can't use them themselves to protect against a Ukrainian counterattack. That is the objective of fortified positions, being able to be used to defend yourself, but not allowing the enemy to use it once they capture it. And this is exactly what the Ukrainians have built these fortifications with the fact in mind, and this will allow the Russians to attack from the rear and give them an advantage in doing so. There's going to be no extra defensive position covering the Ukrainians from the west or from the north. Instead, we do see that there is an edge to it that covers the southern direction in most of these fortified positions, and this means that the Russians attacking from the northern flank in between that of the southern and northern directions, and then likely going to be moving further up, will allow the Russians to flank these fortified positions from the rear at their weakest point. Further north, the Russians are fighting at Yelisavetivka, where they have managed to capture the southern outskirts of the settlement and gain a foothold within it. There is some footage of Russian armored vehicles being destroyed in the northern parts, where Ukrainian soldiers have taken the picture of it, which indicates that there is a combined effort by the Russians to attack from the eastern direction and the southern direction. It is reported that fighting has been taking place at the settlement for 2 weeks, but the Russians have been unable to gain a proper foothold into the settlement to then advance further. While the Ukrainian resistance is very powerful in the area, they also have the support of the fortified positions in the southern flank, making it difficult for the Russians to widen their front, especially with the river line, cutting off the connection between Katerinivka and Yelisavetivka. So there's a lot of benefits the Ukrainians have in the defense of this settlement, which makes it difficult for the Russians to capture it. And this is why a new flank opening from the rear is very critical for the Russian forces. They are unlikely to pressure the Ukrainians heavily in Yelisavetivka until they have improved their positions in the west, flanking or potentially completely bypassing the settlement completely, forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw across the river line towards Romanivka. Further north, the Russians have advanced to capture the remaining parts of Vovchenka and reach the outskirts of Stepanivka along the river line. The Ukrainians are continuously being pushed back here to the north of Kurakhove as Russians continue the pressure from the eastern direction. The main force of the Ukrainians was sent to defend the northern flank, which has led to the Russians advancing along the eastern parts and then moving along the front line in that direction. So we see a Russian adaptation to where the Ukrainian forces were strong and where they were weak, and took full advantage of their weakness to then push along the Vovcha river line, slowly forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw from one settlement to another, after which they heavily bombarded them in that movement. Further north, there's some fighting reported near Rifka, where the Russians are attempting to gain a foothold, but the Ukrainians are yet again putting up heavy resistance, making it difficult for the Russians to advance further. Deep State released a new video where there was some infantry being dropped off in the forest lines in between Vishneve and Rivka under heavy fire of Ukrainian drones and artillery. Moving further north, we see in the direction of Terny, the Russians have recaptured the northern outskirts of the settlement. Following the securing of the road in the eastern direction towards the settlement and connecting it with Russian advance, the Russians were able to secure their positions here in the northern parts yet again, with this geolocated footage confirming this. So we see heavy fighting continues in Terny. There's a lot of back and forth as the Ukrainians attempt to recapture some positions, and the Russians continue to push the Ukrainians back from the eastern and northern direction. Moving further north to the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have captured some of the forest patches and forest lines in the northern direction, increasing the buffer zone between the Russian settlements and the Ukrainian held ones, while the Ukrainians recaptured Novaya Soroshina and pushed the Russians out of the settlement back towards the railways. So we see heavy fighting continues here in the northern direction of the Kursk region, where the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting back and forth. Now that the Russian momentum ended with the capture of Lyubimovka, the Ukrainians were unable to withdraw their forces, ending in an encirclement in both Lyubimovka and Olgovka, which the Russians took full advantage of, fully encircled them, and cleared the settlements. So we see that the Russians have made full use of the momentum they gained, but the Ukrainians, with additional reinforcements such as the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 17th Tank Brigade, were able to stabilize the front line yet again and start balancing it out a bit more. So we see that the Ukrainians are now attempting to regain some positions, do some counterattacks, and free up some forces, to which the Russians are continually applying pressure to the Ukrainian positions. In the southern direction, there's also been a rotation of troops to deal with the Russian offensive, which suddenly captured a lot of territory. The Ukrainians have rotated in the 1st Assault Battalion Da Vinci, which arrived in early October. There's the 37th Marine Brigade, which arrived in the 21st of October. There is the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade that arrived in early October. And then there's the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, which arrived on the 20th of October. So there are two sets of forces rotated in, which both arrived towards the early to end October, following the Russian capture of Volodar, and then yet again when the Russians restarted their pressure to launch offensive operations to capture the settlements of Novoukrayinka, Shakhtarske, Yasna Polyana, Maximivka, Bohuyavlenka, and Katerinivka. And this really shows how much territory the Russians have captured following the fall of Volodar. The fall of Volodar happened on the 1st of October. Since then, the Russians have captured the settlements of Katerinivka, Bohuyavlenka, and so on, capturing all of these settlements along the front line to capture this entire territory. And if we look to the north of Kuru, we see a similar manner where the Russians have captured a lot of territory, capturing the rest of Maximilianivka, Ostre, so on, to then push the Ukrainians completely back from what they previously held, where in the month of October, the Russians captured, just in this southern part around Kurakhove, about 350 square kilometers. If we also include the parts here west of the Remevsky Lech, that's 26 square kilometers, the area with the capture of the several settlements, 181 square kilometers, in the Katerinivka direction, 28 square kilometers, and in the Seledove direction from the north to the south near Kurakhove, 173 square kilometers. It all adds up to 400 square kilometers between Seledove to the north and all the way down south to the Remevsky Lech. All in all, we see that the month of October was very successful for the Russians, and they are attempting to continue the current momentum that they are holding by capturing more and more territory around Kuru, push into the city, and then capture the settlement. Following this, the Russians will look to advance beyond that in a western and northern direction to begin the siege of Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for the ones who are supporting me so far. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.